History is a repeating loop of the same calculated disaster. Governments choose to destroy their currency rather than their discipline, and savers always pay the price. From the diluted silver of Roman coins to the Great Debasement of 1544 where English wealth vanished by 66% in years, the playbook never changes. This one historical pattern explains why your purchasing power is systematically eroding and how empires throughout time have financed their survival by liquidating your life's work. By the year 284 AD, the Roman Empire was no longer a symbol of invincible strength but a patient in critical condition, gasping for air as its foundation crumbled. When a soldier named Diocletian ascended the imperial throne, he did not just inherit a fractured military, he inherited a state on the absolute brink of total collapse. Interestingly, this downfall was not being driven by the external blades of barbarian conquerors or the silent sweep of a plague. Instead, Rome was hemorrhaging its internal vitality through the systematic and deliberate destruction of its own currency. This was a slow-motion car crash of fiscal policy that would set the stage for a recurring tragedy, a historical drama that has played out across every major civilization for the next 17 centuries. Mechanics of this ruin were deceptively simple, acting as a siren song for any government burdened by expenses it could not cover through traditional taxation. Whether the state needed to fund a massive war, pacify a restless and hungry population, or maintain a bloated bureaucracy, the solution was always the same: create more money. In the ancient world, this meant calling in the coinage, melting it down, and mixing the precious silver with cheap base metals before reissuing them. By the medieval period in Europe, the strategy evolved into minting new coins with significantly less silver content while insisting they maintain the same face value. In our modern era, this ancient sleight of hand has been replaced by the digital expansion of the money supply through central bank operations. The denarius serves as the ultimate cautionary tale of this process. Once a coin of nearly pure silver, it was diluted so aggressively that citizens eventually looked down at their palms to see a cheap bronze core peeking through a fading silver wash. The social fallout was immediate and devastating. Merchants began flatly refusing the currency, while soldiers, the very backbone of the empire, demanded their wages in physical food rather than worthless metal. For the prudent families who had spent generations accumulating savings, their life's work simply evaporated. Diocletian attempted to stop the bleeding with the Edict on Maximum Prices, a brutal decree that fixed the cost of everything from basic wheat to wagon wheels. He backed this policy with the ultimate threat: anyone caught charging more would face the death penalty. Yet, the edict failed spectacularly. Goods vanished from the legitimate markets almost overnight, and within a single generation, black markets flourished as the only places where commerce actually functioned. While the immediate effect allowed the government to spend wealth it did not possess, the long-term reality was a total currency reform and the crushing decline of purchasing power for every citizen. Consider the wreckage of 16th-century England to see how this fiscal rot takes hold. By 1544, King Henry VIII found himself trapped between a rock and a hard place. His thirst for military glory led to expensive wars with France and Scotland, and his vanity demanded a court of unmatched splendor, all while he frantically funded the construction of massive coastal fortifications. Facing a parliament that was digging in its heels against new taxes, Henry chose a path of least resistance known as the Great Debasement. Over a disastrous 7-year window ending in 1551, the silver purity of English coinage was slashed from a respectable 92% to a hollow 25%. While the crown reaped massive short-term profits, the fallout for the public was a total economic eclipse. In less than a decade, ordinary savers watched 2/3 of their accumulated wealth vanish into thin air. As the economy convulsed, merchants were forced to hike prices and workers grew desperate for higher wages. Although Elizabeth I eventually spent years painstakingly restoring the currency's integrity, the financial scars left on that generation of savers remained deep and irreversible. The narrative turns even more atmospheric in revolutionary France. By 1789, the monarchy was drowning in debts from decades of warfare, including its heavy support for the American Revolution. The new revolutionary government inherited this fiscal nightmare and attempted to solve it by issuing the assignat, a paper currency supposedly anchored by confiscated church lands. Initially, these notes were handled with care and maintained their value. However, as the revolution radicalized and conflict spread across Europe, the government turned the printing presses into a high-speed engine of inflation. By 1795, a staggering 40 billion assignats flooded the streets. The numbers tell a terrifying story. A basket of goods that cost 100 livres in 1790 exploded to 1,000 assignats by 1794, and reached a surreal 13,000 assignats just 1 year later. Rather than slowing down, the state doubled down, declaring currency speculation a crime punishable by death. In a dark irony, the guillotine became the ultimate debt collector, serving as a blade-sharp enforcer for a monetary policy that had already decapitated the savings of every prudent citizen. Successive governments simply could not resist the seductive temptation to print. By the 13th century, the Yuan dynasty had succumbed so completely to this impulse that they flooded the market with paper notes, causing prices to quintuple within the span of a single generation. As trust evaporated, Chinese merchants began flatly refusing the currency. The state responded with iron-fisted coercion, declaring this refusal a capital crime and executing those who dared to reject the debased tender. Yet, no amount of state-sponsored violence could resuscitate faith in a currency that had been systematically hollowed out. This catastrophic failure served as a multi-generational cautionary tale, prompting the subsequent Ming dynasty to abandon paper money entirely for over 4 centuries, retreating to the safety of hard assets after a failed monetary experiment. What makes this recurring pattern so uniquely heartless is that it weaponizes the very virtues that societies claim to hold most dear. Saving is, at its core, the ultimate act of delayed gratification. It is a deliberate decision to tighten one's belt today to ensure survival tomorrow. We see this in the diligent farmer who stockpiles surplus grain in a silo to weather a future drought, or the ambitious entrepreneur who pools every cent of capital to build a legacy, or the worker who meticulously tucks away wages for the inevitable frailty of old age. While every culture's moral framework celebrates this brand of prudence, governments under fiscal strain treat these savers as invisible cows to be milked. The mechanism of this theft is clinical. The government acts as the first spender, injecting new money into the economy and capturing its full purchasing power before prices have a chance to react. By the time this expanded supply trickles down and forces prices upward, the prudent saver discovers that their stored labor buys less and less. The 20th century essentially industrialized this cruelty. In the Weimar Republic between 1921 and 1923, the German mark collapsed from an exchange rate of 330 marks per dollar in January 1922 to a mind-bending 4.2 trillion marks by November 1923. This hyperinflationary spiral created a world where a lifetime of work was reduced to nothing. Pensioners who had contributed decades of labor to the state suddenly found that their entire monthly payout could buy only a single loaf of bread. The aftermath of the German collapse saw the effective liquidation of the middle class, a demographic erasure that historians still scrutinize as the primary catalyst for the violent political upheavals that followed. Yet, as catastrophic as the Weimar experience was, post-World War II Hungary managed to find an even darker basement. By the peak of the crisis in July 1946, the Hungarian pengo had essentially dissolved into thin air, with prices doubling every 15 hours. To keep up with the carnage, the government introduced farcical denominations like the milpengo, worth $1 million, and eventually the bilpengo, worth $1 trillion. For Hungarian savers, the result was a clinical execution of their financial lives. Years of accumulated wealth were rendered completely worthless in just a few months. This pattern is not a relic of the distant past. In the 2000s, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation followed the exact same script, a government printing money to bridge its deficits, a resulting price spiral, and the eventual abandonment of its own currency after the public savings were hollowed out. What is truly remarkable is not the occurrence of these individual disasters, but the eerie consistency of the mechanism across every political spectrum. Whether it is Roman emperors, medieval monarchs, revolutionary committees, or even modern democracies, the playbook is identical. A government fabricates more monetary units, and the existing ones lose purchasing power. This serves as a hidden trapdoor, a quiet confiscation of wealth that leaves savers penniless. When the victims protest, the state often pivots to blame, accusing them of hoarding or lack of patriotism to distract from its own fiscal handiwork. Modern central banking was pitched as the ultimate shield against this ancient cycle. The vision involved independent institutions led by technical experts, theoretically insulated from the grubby hands of political pressure. For several decades, this experiment seemed to hold, with modest inflation allowing savers to generally preserve their purchasing power. However, the fundamental tension remains an open wound in the global economy. While the method has evolved from the crude physical practice of clipping the edges off silver coins to a high-tech suite of maneuvers involving bond purchases and adjusted reserve requirements, the underlying machinery remains unchanged. In our era, the debasement occurs whenever the money supply is forced to expand at a velocity that far outstrips the actual productive capacity of the economy. This is not a matter of conspiracy or accident, it is the inevitable mathematical fallout of a supply-demand imbalance. The United States offers a starkly clear window into this modern alchemy. A pivotal moment arrived in 1971 when the final tether linking the dollar to gold was severed, effectively removing the last external anchor on money creation. Without that heavy chain to hold it back, the monetary base began a vertical climb. In 2000, the monetary base was approximately $600 billion, but by 2020, it had ballooned to a staggering $5 trillion. During this identical 20-year window, the official consumer price index more than doubled. For the American saver holding cash or cash equivalents, this meant that a dollar in 2020 possessed less than half the purchasing power it held at the turn of the millennium. The justifications for this expansion follow a weary, familiar script. Leaders point to a rolling conveyor belt of emergencies, wars, pandemics, economic crises, or natural disasters, that supposedly necessitate immediate, unbridled spending. They argue that the traditional alternatives of hiking taxes or slashing budgets are either too agonizing for the public or politically impossible to execute. There is always a promise that the expansion is merely temporary and that fiscal discipline will magically reappear once the storm passes. Some even convince themselves that this time, modern economic science has finally figured out how to print money without the tail of inflation following close behind. Those who object are often painted as selfish hoarders who place their private gains above the public good. Yet, the historical record is unambiguous. Every sustained expansion in history has acted as a silent siphon, transferring wealth from savers to those who get to spend the new money first. This is the same mechanism that linked 3rd century Roman savers to their 18th century French counterparts, and it remains the invisible tax on the modern world. Instead of a direct seizure, savers simply wake up to find that their hard-earned wealth possesses less and less utility as the years pass. This dynamic functions exactly like a phantom levy, a slow-motion extraction of value that operates so gradually it rarely triggers the political backlash of a traditional tax hike. While citizens immediately take up arms over a rise in property or income taxes, they are far less likely to notice a modest 3% annual decline in their purchasing power. Yet, this cumulative erosion is a financial death by 1,000 cuts. Over several decades, the impact is nothing short of devastating. This creates a profound moral hazard at the heart of the state. Governments quickly learn that they can bankroll their agendas without the electoral fallout of taxation by simply manufacturing money. Simultaneously, the public receives a harsh lesson in the new reality. The classic virtues of prudence and deferred gratification now lead straight to financial ruin. In this environment, the only logical move is to flip the traditional script on its head. People begin to save less and consume more, preferring to pile on debt rather than stockpile currency. They engage in a frantic escape from the currency itself, diving into any tangible asset that might serve as a life raft for their value. The entire economy eventually reorganizes itself around the grim assumption that money is a melting ice cube. Behavior that would be considered reckless or irrational in a stable monetary system suddenly becomes the only way to survive. Conversely, the careful habits that once built civilizations are now seen as foolish. This is a tragedy because healthy economies are built on the bedrock of saved capital. Without people willing to defer their consumption, there is no pool of wealth for businesses to borrow, no funds to build infrastructure, and no capital to fuel innovation. By systematically punishing the saver, the government chooses short-term political convenience at the cost of long-term prosperity. They get to spend today, but the society loses the very seed corn required for tomorrow's growth. History proves this pattern only ends when the currency itself breaks. Rome was forced into a total reform after its collapse. France's assignats were abandoned as worthless, the German mark was replaced, and Zimbabwe's dollar was simply discontinued. In every instance, the finale was a chaotic explosion of wealth destruction that left savers buried in the rubble. The inevitable financial reset is always a painful affair, a reckoning that history demands without exception. In the high-stakes theater of global finance, the question is never if a correction will occur, but rather when it will arrive and how severe the final adjustment will be. Today's global financial system operates on a gargantuan scale that would have been utterly inconceivable to the ancient Romans. While they dealt in physical coins and measured wealth in the millions, we navigate a digital landscape where central bank balance sheets are calculated in the trillions. Yet, despite this shift from tangible metal to flickering screen entries, the fundamental dynamics of the system remain identical to the patterns of antiquity. The recurrent monetary cycle remains an iron law of human governance. It begins when governments consistently spend more than they collect, followed by central banks expanding the money supply to accommodate that deficit. Consequently, prices rise, and savers inevitably lose their purchasing power. While technology evolves at a breakneck pace, human nature and political incentives remain frozen in time. To understand our current trajectory, one must simply ask if the same pressures that broke past empires are still at play today. Governments clearly still face spending demands that far exceed their willingness to levy taxes, and central banks certainly retain the unchecked power to expand the money supply. Furthermore, the basic laws of supply and demand apply to currency just as they do to any other commodity. If these conditions are met, then the same mechanism that penalized the prudent in Rome, medieval England, revolutionary France, and Weimar Germany is still fully operative. The historical lesson spanning 17 centuries is an uncomfortable but undeniable truth. When empires are forced to choose between the hard road of fiscal discipline and the easy path of currency debasement, they choose debasement every single time. Modern authorities may mask this choice with sophisticated labels like quantitative easing, monetary accommodation, or emergency stimulus, but these are merely new masks for an old ghost. For the individual who has deferred consumption and worked with diligence, the result is a slow, steady erosion of purchasing power. History does not repeat, but it certainly echoes, and the pattern connecting our present to the failed systems of the past is a loud, persistent reminder that savers always pay the price for an empire's survival.